Sometimes a single moment of courage can change the course of history. In 1847, when tensions between settlers and Native American tribes reached their breaking point across the Texas frontier, one woman's split-second decision to help a drowning child would spark an unlikely alliance that saved an entire settlement from destruction. This is the true story of how Martha Henderson's act of compassion toward a young Comanche boy created a bond that transcended cultural boundaries and changed two communities forever. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Texas prairie as Martha Henderson stepped out of her modest log cabin, the wooden bucket heavy in her calloused hands. At 28, she had already lived through more hardships than most women twice her age. Her weathered face told the story of countless days under the harsh frontier sun, but her green eyes still held a spark of determination that had carried her family through the worst of times. The settlement of Cedar Creek was nothing more than a collection of rough-hewn buildings scattered along a bend in a shallow river that gave the town its name. 37 families had carved out their existence in this remote corner of Texas, far from the safety of larger towns and military outposts. They had come here seeking fertile land and a fresh start, but what they found was a constant struggle against the elements, wild animals, and the ever-present threat of Indian raids. Martha's husband John had been one of the first to stake a claim along the riverbank 3 years earlier. He had promised her a better life, away from the crowded settlements back east where opportunities were scarce and competition fierce. But John Henderson had been dead for 8 months now, killed when his horse threw him during a cattle roundup. The broken neck had been mercifully quick, but it left Martha alone with 2 young children and a homestead that demanded more strength than she sometimes felt she possessed. 8-year-old Samuel and 6-year-old Emma were still sleeping in the cabin's single bedroom as Martha made her way toward the river. The morning ritual of fetching water had become her moment of solitude, a brief respite before the day's endless chores began. She paused at the edge of their small vegetable garden, noting with satisfaction that the corn was finally showing healthy green shoots. If the rains continued and the insects didn't destroy the crop, they might actually have enough food to last through the winter. The path to the river wound through a grove of cottonwood trees that provided welcome shade during the brutal summer months. Martha had walked this route hundreds of times, her feet knowing every root and stone along the way. She moved quietly, enjoying the peaceful sounds of the awakening prairie. Meadowlarks called from their perches in the tall grass, and somewhere in the distance, she could hear the lowing of cattle from the Morrison Ranch. As she approached the riverbank, Martha noticed that the water level was lower than usual. The spring rains had been sporadic this year, and the creek that had once run deep enough for swimming now barely reached her knees in most places. She knelt at her usual spot, where the current had carved a deeper pool, and began filling the bucket. The water was surprisingly cold for late May, fed by underground springs that never warmed completely even in the height of summer. Martha cupped her hands and splashed some on her face, savoring the refreshing coolness. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine what life might have been like if John were still alive. He would be preparing to ride out to check the cattle, probably grumbling about the dry weather and the price of grain. Emma would be begging to ride along, as she always did, while Samuel would be more interested in the book of Bible stories that Martha read to them each evening. A splash downstream caught her attention. At first, she assumed it was a fish jumping or perhaps a beaver slapping its tail. But then she heard something that made her blood run cold, the sound of a child crying out in distress. Martha dropped the bucket and ran toward the sound, her long skirts hampering her movement as she pushed through the undergrowth along the riverbank. What she saw when she reached the source of the commotion made her gasp in horror. A young boy, no more than 10 or 11 years old, was trapped in what appeared to be quicksand near the river's edge. The more he struggled, the deeper he sank, and Martha could see the panic in his dark eyes as he fought against the sucking mud. But this was no ordinary settler child. The boy's bronze skin, long black hair, and the distinctive beadwork on his leather clothing marked him unmistakably as Comanche. Martha's first instinct was to step back, to flee to the safety of the settlement, and alert the other families that Indians were in the area. The Comanche were feared throughout Texas for their fierce resistance to white settlement and their skill as warriors. Only 2 months earlier, a family 30 miles south had been killed in a raid, their homestead burned to the ground. The boy's desperate cries brought her back to the immediate crisis. Whatever his heritage, he was just a child, and he was going to die if someone didn't help him immediately. Martha could see that he had sunk up to his chest, and his movements were becoming weaker as exhaustion set in. Without allowing herself time to think about the consequences, Martha looked around frantically for something that might serve as a rope. Her eyes fell on a thick grapevine that had wound itself around one of the cottonwood trees. She grabbed her belt knife and began sawing at the vine, her hands shaking with urgency. The vine was tougher than it looked, and precious seconds ticked by as Martha worked to cut free a length long enough to reach the trapped boy. She could hear him calling out in his native language, words she didn't understand but whose meaning was clear. He was terrified and growing weaker by the moment. Finally, the vine came free. Martha quickly tested its strength, hoping it would hold the weight of a child. She tied one end around the trunk of the nearest tree, testing the knot to make sure it was secure. Then, holding the other end, she began working her way carefully toward the quicksand. The ground near the bog was treacherous, soft, and yielding underfoot. Martha had to proceed slowly, testing each step to make sure she wouldn't become trapped herself. She had heard stories of entire horses disappearing into quicksand, swallowed up so completely that no trace remained. When she was close enough, Martha called out to the boy, trying to get his attention. He looked at her with a mixture of hope and confusion, clearly surprised to see a white woman coming to his aid. Martha gestured toward the vine, trying to communicate her plan without words. The boy seemed to understand. He stopped struggling and waited as Martha carefully lowered the vine toward him. It took several attempts to get it close enough for him to grab, and Martha's arms were aching from the strain of holding her position on the unstable ground. Finally, his small fingers closed around the vine. Martha began to pull, slowly and steadily, fighting against the suction of the quicksand that seemed determined to claim its victim. The boy helped as much as he could, using the vine to pull himself upward while Martha provided the anchoring force. Progress was agonizingly slow. For every inch the boy gained, the quicksand seemed to pull him back half that distance. Martha's muscles burned with the effort, and sweat poured down her face despite the cool morning air. She gritted her teeth and continued pulling, refusing to give up. Gradually, the boy began to emerge from the deadly trap. First his arms became free, then his shoulders. Martha repositioned herself, getting a better grip on the vine and bracing her feet against a fallen log for more leverage. With a sound like a giant cork being pulled from a bottle, the quicksand released its hold on the boy's torso. The sudden release nearly sent Martha tumbling backward, but she managed to keep her footing. The boy was now free up to his waist, and the worst of the danger was past. With renewed energy, both of them worked together to complete his escape. When the boy finally crawled onto solid ground, both he and Martha collapsed from exhaustion. They lay on the riverbank, breathing heavily and covered in mud. Martha looked at the child she had just saved, really seeing him for the first time. He was younger than she had initially thought, probably no more than 9 years old. His black hair was plastered to his head with mud, and his clothing was ruined, but his dark eyes were alert and intelligent. There was something regal about his bearing, even in his bedraggled state, that suggested he was not just any Comanche child. The boy sat up slowly, his gaze fixed on Martha's face. Then, to her surprise, he spoke in halting but understandable English. "You saved my life," he said simply. "I am Running Wolf, son of Chief Red Eagle of the Antelope Band." Martha's heart skipped a beat. She had just saved the son of a Comanche chief. The implications of this act were staggering and terrifying. What would happen when the boy's people discovered that he had been rescued by a white woman? Would they see it as a kindness to be repaid, or as evidence that their enemies were in the area? "My name is Martha Henderson," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Are you hurt?" Running Wolf flexed his arms and legs, testing for injuries. "No hurt," he said, "but very scared. Thought I would die in the mud that eats people." Despite everything, Martha found herself smiling at his description of the quicksand. "Yes, it is dangerous. How did you get trapped?" The boy's face darkened with shame. "I was following deer tracks. Wanted to show my father I could hunt like a warrior. Did not see the bad ground until too late." Martha nodded, understanding the universal desire of children to prove themselves to their parents. Her own Samuel was constantly trying to demonstrate his maturity and capability, often getting himself into trouble in the process. "Your father will be worried about you," she said. "How far is your camp?" Running Wolf pointed toward the hills that rose beyond the river. "1 day's ride, but they will not look for me until tonight. I was to practice hunting until the sun sets." Martha felt a chill of fear. A Comanche hunting party would certainly discover the white settlement when they came looking for the chief's son. The families of Cedar Creek would be defenseless against mounted warriors, and the nearest military garrison was more than 100 miles away. But looking at the grateful face of the child beside her, Martha knew she couldn't regret her decision to help him. She had acted from instinct and compassion, and she would have to deal with whatever consequences followed. "You should return to your people," she said. "They will be frightened when you don't come back." Running Wolf nodded, but he made no move to leave. Instead, he studied Martha's face with the intense curiosity of childhood. "Why did you help me?" he asked. "Your people and my people are enemies." Martha was quiet for a long moment, considering the question. "Because you're a child," she said finally, "and you needed help. That's more important than anything else." The boy seemed to consider this answer carefully. Then he reached into a small pouch at his waist and withdrew something that glinted in the morning sun. It was a small silver medallion, roughly circular, with intricate engravings that Martha couldn't decipher. "This belonged to my grandfather," Running Wolf said, holding out the medallion. "He was a great war chief, and it has powerful medicine. I want you to have it." Martha shook her head. "I can't take something so valuable. Besides, your father would be angry if you gave away your grandfather's medallion." "My father will understand when I tell him what you did," the boy said with quiet confidence. "Please take it. In my people's way, a life debt must be paid." Reluctantly, Martha accepted the medallion. It was heavier than it looked, and the silver was worn smooth in places by generations of handling. She could feel the weight of history and tradition in the small object. "Thank you," she said, "but please don't feel that you owe me anything. I would help any child in danger." Running Wolf stood and began cleaning the mud from his clothes as best he could. "I must go now," he said, "but I will not forget what you did, and neither will my father." There was something in the way he said those last words that made Martha uneasy. She couldn't tell if they were meant as a promise or a warning. The boy started to walk away, then turned back. "White woman who saves Comanche children," he said solemnly. "You have made both a friend and an enemy today. I pray for your sake that my father chooses to see you as a friend." With that cryptic statement, Running Wolf disappeared into the tall grass, moving with a silent grace that was legendary among his people. Martha watched until she could no longer see him, then slowly made her way back to where she had dropped the water bucket. As she filled the bucket again, her mind raced with worry about what she had set in motion. Should she warn the other families in the settlement? Should they prepare for an attack? Or would that only make the situation worse if the Comanche chief decided to approach peacefully? Martha decided to say nothing for now. There was no point in causing panic over something that might never happen. Running Wolf had said his people wouldn't miss him until evening, which meant any search party wouldn't reach the area until tomorrow at the earliest. She walked back to the cabin slowly, the water bucket heavier than usual in her trembling hands. Samuel and Emma were awake when she entered, sitting at the rough wooden table where she served their meals. "Mama, you were gone a long time," Emma said, her 6-year-old face creased with concern. "We were worried." "I'm sorry, sweetheart," Martha said, setting the bucket down and forcing a smile. "I just got distracted by how pretty the river looked this morning." Samuel, always the more observant of her two children, studied her muddy dress and disheveled appearance. "You look like you fell down, Mama. Are you hurt?" "No, I'm fine," Martha assured him. "Just clumsy this morning. Now, who wants to help me make breakfast?" As she went through the familiar motions of preparing the morning meal, Martha's thoughts kept returning to her encounter with Running Wolf. The boy had seemed intelligent and mature for his age, but he was still just a child. How much influence would his account of the rescue have with his father, a man who had undoubtedly spent his entire adult life fighting against white settlement of his people's traditional lands? The medallion felt heavy in the pocket where she had hidden it. Martha pulled it out briefly to examine it more closely. The engravings were definitely Native American in style, with symbols that might represent animals or natural forces. There were also what looked like scratches or marks that could have been some form of writing, though Martha had no way of interpreting them. Whatever the medallion's significance, she knew she was now connected to the Comanche boy and his people in a way that could not be easily undone. The question was whether that connection would prove to be a blessing or a curse for the families of Cedar Creek. The morning passed quietly, with no sign of Indian activity in the area. Martha went through her usual routine of tending to the chickens, working in the garden, and preparing the noon meal. But she found herself constantly scanning the horizon, watching for any movement that might indicate approaching riders. By afternoon, her nerves were stretched to the breaking point. Every bird call made her jump, and every gust of wind through the grass sounded like approaching hoofbeats. Samuel and Emma sensed her tension and became quieter than usual, staying close to the cabin instead of playing in their favorite spots along the river. As the sun began to set, Martha finally allowed herself to hope that maybe Running Wolf had reached his people safely and that no search party would be necessary. Perhaps the boy would tell his father about the rescue, and the matter would be forgotten. Perhaps life in Cedar Creek would continue as it always had, with the Comanche remaining a distant threat rather than an immediate presence. But even as she tried to convince herself that the danger had passed, Martha kept the loaded rifle close at hand and made sure the cabin door was securely barred when darkness fell. She lay awake long into the night, listening to every sound from outside and clutching the silver medallion that had become both a treasured gift and a symbol of the uncertain future she had created with one impulsive act of mercy. The next morning dawned clear and hot, with no wind to stir the oppressive air. Martha woke before sunrise, as had become her habit since John's death. She dressed quietly and stepped outside to begin her chores, grateful for the cooler temperature of early dawn. She had just finished milking their single cow when she heard the sound that she had been both expecting and dreading. From somewhere in the distance came the rhythmic thunder of many horses moving at speed. Martha dropped the milk pail and ran to wake the children. "Samuel, Emma, get up quickly," she called, her voice sharp with urgency. "We need to get to the Morrisons' house right now." The children, still groggy with sleep, stumbled out of bed and began pulling on their clothes. "What's wrong, Mama?" Samuel asked, immediately alert despite his drowsiness. "Just get dressed and don't ask questions," Martha replied, grabbing the rifle and checking to make sure it was loaded. "We need to hurry." The Morrison Ranch was the largest homestead in Cedar Creek, with a stone house that could serve as a fortress if necessary. Frank Morrison was also the closest thing the settlement had to a military leader, having served as a cavalry officer before retiring to Texas. If trouble was coming, that's where the families would gather. Martha hustled her children out of the cabin and toward the Morrison place, glancing frequently over her shoulder at the eastern hills where the sound of horses seemed to be growing louder. Other families were emerging from their homes as well, the men carrying rifles and the women gathering children with the same urgency that Martha felt. They reached the Morrison house just as the first riders appeared on the ridge overlooking Cedar Creek. Martha's heart nearly stopped when she saw them. There were at least 30 Comanche warriors mounted on painted ponies, their weapons glinting in the morning sun. They sat motionless on the ridgeline, like statues carved from bronze and shadow. "Dear God in heaven," Frank Morrison breathed, lowering his spyglass. "I've never seen so many of them at once." The warriors began to move down the hill toward the settlement, their ponies stepping carefully on the steep slope. Martha could see that they were painted for war, with bold stripes and symbols covering both the men and their mounts. Feathers and scalps decorated their lances, and their faces were set in expressions of grim determination. But as they drew closer, Martha noticed something that didn't fit with her expectations of a war party. The warriors were not spread out in attack formation, and they were making no attempt to approach the settlement stealthily. Instead, they rode in a tight group, with several of them carrying what appeared to be a flag or banner of some kind. "They're not attacking," Martha said suddenly. "Look at how they're riding. That's not how you approach an enemy." Frank Morrison squinted through his spyglass again. "You're right," he said with surprise. "They're riding like a delegation. But what in blazes would a Comanche delegation want with us?" Martha's hand moved unconsciously to the medallion in her pocket. She was beginning to suspect that she knew exactly what had brought these warriors to Cedar Creek, and the knowledge filled her with both hope and terror. The Comanche riders stopped about 100 yards from the Morrison house, well within rifle range, but far enough away to avoid appearing immediately threatening. One of them, a man with an elaborate feathered headdress and intricate beadwork on his shirt, urged his horse forward a few steps. "I am Red Eagle, chief of the Antelope Band," he called out in English that was heavily accented, but perfectly understandable. "I come to speak with the white woman who saved my son from the mud that swallows." Martha's knees nearly buckled with relief and fear. Running Wolf had made it home safely, and he had told his father about the rescue. But what did Chief Red Eagle want with her? Was this a social call, a gesture of gratitude, or something else entirely? "Martha," Frank Morrison said quietly, I think that's you he's looking for. Martha's mouth went dry as every eye in the settlement turned toward her. The weight of 30 rifles and the expectant faces of her neighbors felt almost as intimidating as the Comanche war party waiting in the distance. Frank Morrison's weathered hand gripped her shoulder. "You save an Indian boy," he whispered harshly. "When? How?" "Yesterday morning," Martha replied, her voice barely audible. "He was trapped in quicksand by the river. I couldn't just let him die." A murmur of shock and anger rippled through the gathered settlers. Some of the men raised their rifles, clearly believing that Martha's act of mercy had brought this danger upon them all. But Frank Morrison held up his hand for silence. "What's done is done," he said firmly. "Now we need to deal with what's in front of us." He looked directly at Martha. "That chief wants to talk to you. Question is, are you willing to go out there?" Martha looked toward the mounted warriors, her heart pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. Chief Red Eagle sat motionless on his painted pony, waiting for her response. Even at this distance, she could see the family resemblance between him and his son. They had the same proud bearing, the same intelligent dark eyes. "He's not here for war," Martha said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "If he wanted to attack us, he would have done it already. He wants to talk." "Maybe," Frank replied, "but that doesn't mean it's safe for you to walk out there. These are Comanche warriors, Martha. They don't think the same way we do." Emma tugged at Martha's skirt, her small face filled with confusion and fear. "Mama, what's happening? Who are those men?" Martha knelt down and pulled both her children close. "They're Indians, sweetheart, but they're not here to hurt us. Mama helped one of their children yesterday, and now they want to thank her." It was a simplified explanation, but Martha hoped it was also an accurate one. She had no way of knowing what Chief Red Eagle truly intended, but something in his manner suggested formality rather than hostility. Samuel, always older than his years, studied the distant warriors with serious eyes. "Are you going to go talk to them, Mama?" "I think I have to," Martha replied. "They came all this way to see me. It would be rude not to meet with them." "Rude?" Frank Morrison nearly choked on the word. "Martha, these are the same Indians who've been raiding settlements all across Texas. Rude is the least of your worries." "But they're not raiding now," Martha pointed out. "They're asking for a meeting. Maybe this is a chance to make peace with them." Some of the other settlers scoffed at the idea. "Make peace with Comanche?" Tom Bradley called out. "Might as well try to make peace with rattlesnakes." But Martha could see that Frank Morrison was considering her words more carefully. As a former cavalry officer, he understood the value of intelligence and negotiation in dealing with Indian tribes. "If you're determined to do this," he said finally, "you won't go alone. I'll come with you, and we'll bring a white flag to show our peaceful intentions." Martha nodded gratefully. She wasn't sure she had the courage to walk out there by herself, despite her conviction that the Comanche chief meant no immediate harm. Frank turned to address the other settlers. "Everyone else stays here with weapons ready. If this goes badly, you'll need to be prepared to defend yourselves. But nobody shoots unless I give the signal." "Understood." The men nodded reluctantly, their faces grim with worry and disapproval. Martha knew that some of them blamed her for bringing this danger to their community, and she couldn't entirely fault their reasoning. Her impulsive act of kindness had certainly set events in motion that none of them could have anticipated. Martha kissed her children goodbye, trying to project more confidence than she felt. "I'll be back soon," she promised. "Mrs. Morrison will take care of you while I'm gone." Frank Morrison tied a white cloth to the end of a long stick, creating a makeshift flag of truce. Then he and Martha began walking slowly toward the waiting Comanche warriors, their footsteps seeming unnaturally loud in the morning stillness. As they drew closer, Martha could see the warriors more clearly. They were a fearsome sight, painted and armed for battle, but they remained motionless and disciplined. Their ponies stamped occasionally and tossed their heads, but the men themselves might have been carved from stone. Chief Red Eagle waited until they were close enough for normal conversation before speaking again. Up close, Martha could see that he was a man in his 40s, with premature gray streaking his long black hair and deep lines around his eyes that spoke of years of worry and responsibility. He wore the regalia of a chief, an elaborate feathered headdress, a shirt decorated with intricate beadwork, and leggings fringed with what Martha tried not to think about too closely. "You are the woman who pulled my son from the hungry earth," he said, his English careful but clear. He had learned the white man's language well, probably through years of trading and negotiation. "Yes," Martha replied simply. "My name is Martha Henderson." Red Eagle nodded solemnly. "I am Red Eagle, war chief of the Antelope Band of the Namurna, whom you call Comanche. My son Running Wolf has told me of your kindness to him." "Any mother would have done the same thing," Martha said. "I couldn't let a child drown, no matter who he was." A slight smile flickered across the chief's stern features. "Not any mother," he said. "Many of your people would have let him die, just as many of my people would have let a white child die. But you chose differently." Frank Morrison cleared his throat. "Chief Red Eagle, we appreciate you coming to speak with us instead of—" He gestured vaguely at the armed warriors behind the chief. "Instead of taking revenge for years of broken treaties and stolen land." Red Eagle finished. "Yes, that would have been the expected response. But my son's life is worth more to me than revenge. And his mother has convinced me that perhaps it is time to try a different path." The chief paused and seemed to be choosing his words carefully. "For 3 generations, my people have fought the white settlers who come to take our hunting grounds. We have had some victories, but we have also suffered many losses. Our young men die in raids, and your soldiers burn our villages. Perhaps there is another way." Martha felt a surge of hope at his words, but Frank Morrison remained skeptical. "What kind of other way are you talking about, Chief?" "A treaty," Red Eagle said simply. "Not with the white chief in Washington, who makes promises he cannot keep. A treaty between my band and your settlement. We leave your people in peace, and you leave us in peace. We share the hunting grounds and the water as people should." The proposition was so unexpected that both Martha and Frank stood speechless for a moment. Treaties with individual tribes were not unheard of, but they were rare and difficult to enforce. Most attempts at local peace agreements had eventually broken down over misunderstandings or the actions of outsiders. That's a generous offer," Frank said carefully. "But I'm not sure I have the authority to negotiate for the whole settlement." "Then you'll talk to your council of elders and give me their answer," Red Eagle replied. "But first, there is another matter." He looked directly at Martha. "My son tells me that you would accept no payment for saving his life. This troubles me greatly." "I don't understand," Martha said. "Among my people, a life debt must be acknowledged and repaid," the chief explained. "To leave such a debt unpaid brings bad medicine to both the giver and the receiver. You must allow me to honor what you have done." Martha shook her head. "Really, Chief Red Eagle, it's not necessary. I don't want any payment." "But I insist," the chief said firmly. Then his expression softened slightly. "My son also tells me that you are a widow. Try to raise 2 children alone. This is a hard path for any woman, but especially hard in this wilderness. Martha was surprised that Running Wolf had observed so much during their brief encounter. Yes, my husband died last year, but we're managing. Are you? Red Eagle asked gently. Winter will come, and winters here are harsh. Your garden is small, and you have only a few animals. What will you do when the food runs out? The question hit uncomfortably close to home. Martha had been trying not to think about the approaching winter and whether she would be able to provide adequately for her children. The crop yields have been disappointing so far, and she had no money to buy supplies from traveling merchants. We'll find a way, she said with more confidence than she felt. Red Eagle nodded approvingly at her determination, but his next words showed that he wasn't deceived by her bravado. Pride is a good thing, but it cannot feed children. I would like to propose an arrangement that would benefit both of us. What kind of arrangement? Frank Morrison asked suspiciously. My people know this land better than anyone, the chief said. We know where the game trails run, where the best fishing spots are hidden, where to find roots and berries that can sustain a family through hard times. We also know how to preserve meat so that it lasts through the winter, and how to prepare hides for clothing and shelter. Martha was beginning to see where this was leading. You want to teach us survival skills? I want to share knowledge, Red Eagle corrected. In exchange, your people could teach us things that would be valuable to us. How to work metal, how to grow crops that store well, how to treat diseases with the white man's medicine. An exchange of knowledge that makes both our people stronger. It was an intriguing proposal, but Martha could see the difficulties immediately. The other settlers might not be willing to learn from Indians, she said honestly. Many of them are afraid of your people, and many of my warriors would rather die than learn anything from whites, Red Eagle admitted. But fear and hatred have brought us nothing but grief. Perhaps it is time to try trust. Frank Morrison was looking thoughtful. This would have to be a gradual process, he said. You couldn't just bring 30 warriors into our settlement and expect people to welcome them with open arms. Of course not, the chief agreed. It would begin small. Perhaps 1 or 2 of my people would visit your settlement, and 1 or 2 of yours would visit our camp. Those who prove themselves trustworthy could serve as, what is your word, ambassadors between our peoples. Martha felt a chill of premonition. You want me to be one of those ambassadors, don't you? Red Eagle's smile was knowing. You have already proven that you can see past the color of a person's skin to the human being beneath. And you have earned the respect of my son, which is no small thing. Running Wolf is known among our people for his wisdom, even though he is young. This is moving awfully fast, Frank Morrison interjected. Yesterday, we didn't even know your people were in the area. Now you're asking us to completely change how we live. Not completely change, Red Eagle said, but perhaps we can change enough to avoid the bloodshed that is coming. What bloodshed? Martha asked, alarmed. The chief's expression grew grave. More white settlers are coming from the east every month. The soldiers will follow them, and then there will be war between my people and yours. We are skilled fighters, but we cannot win against the numbers that are coming. Better to make peace now, while we still have the strength to negotiate as equals. His words carried the weight of prophecy, and Martha could see that Frank Morrison recognized their truth as well. The westward expansion was unstoppable, and the Indian tribes would eventually be overwhelmed by sheer numbers if they continued to resist. I need time to think about this, Martha said, and to discuss it with the other families. Of course, Red Eagle agreed. But do not take too long. The season for raiding is beginning, and some of my young warriors are eager to prove themselves in battle. If I cannot give them hope for a different path, I may not be able to control them much longer. It was both a warning and an opportunity, and Martha understood the delicate position the chief was in. He was trying to lead his people toward peace, but he also had to maintain their respect and loyalty. "How long can you wait?" Frank asked. "1 moon," Red Eagle replied. "At the next full moon, I will return for your answer. If you agree to try the path of cooperation, we will begin slowly and carefully. If you refuse," he shrugged, "then we will continue as we always have, and let fate decide the outcome." The chief turned to Martha one final time. "There is one more thing. My son wished me to give you this." He handed her a small leather pouch, soft and supple with age. Martha opened the pouch to find it filled with seeds unlike any she had ever seen. They were larger than corn kernels, but smaller than beans, with an unusual mottled pattern. "These are seeds of the 3 sisters, corn, beans, and squash that grow together in harmony," Red Eagle explained. "They have been blessed by our medicine man and will grow even in poor soil. Plant them together, and they will feed your family through the winter." Martha looked up at him with tears in her eyes. "Thank you. This is incredibly generous. It is nothing compared to the gift you gave my son," the chief replied. "His life is worth more than all the seeds in the world." Red Eagle raised his hand in farewell, then turned his pony and began riding back toward his waiting warriors. The entire war party wheeled and followed him, moving with the fluid precision of long experience. Within minutes, they had disappeared over the ridge, leaving only dust clouds to mark their passage. Martha and Frank Morrison walked back to the settlement in stunned silence, each lost in their own thoughts about what had just transpired. The other settlers crowded around them the moment they reached the Morrison house, everyone talking at once and demanding to know what the Indians had wanted. Frank raised his hands for quiet. "The chief came to thank Martha for saving his son's life," he announced, "and he made us an offer. He wants to negotiate a peace treaty between his band and our settlement." The reaction was immediate and explosive. Some of the settlers were intrigued by the possibility of peace, while others were outraged at the suggestion of dealing with Indians at all. "You can't trust the Comanche," Tom Bradley declared. "They'll promise you anything, then murder you in your sleep." "Maybe," Frank replied, "but Chief Red Eagle didn't have to come here and talk. He could have just attacked us and taken his revenge for generations of conflict. The fact that he chose to negotiate suggests that he might be sincere. Or it could be a trap," another settler added. "Get us to lower our guard, then strike when we're not expecting it." Martha listened to the debate swirling around her, but her attention kept returning to the pouch of seeds in her hands. The gift seemed to symbolize everything that Chief Red Eagle had talked about. The possibility of 2 different peoples sharing knowledge and resources instead of fighting over them. "What do you think, Martha?" Frank Morrison asked, noticing her distraction. "You're the one who started all this. Do you trust this chief?" Martha considered the question carefully. She thought about Running Wolf's dignity and intelligence, about Red Eagle's respectful manner, and his obvious love for his son. She thought about the alternative, continued warfare that would inevitably end in tragedy for both sides. "I think he's trying to save his people," she said finally. "He knows that fighting us forever will only lead to their destruction. He's offering us a chance to prove that whites and Indians can live together peacefully." "And if he's wrong," someone called out, "if his warriors decide they'd rather fight than cooperate, then we'll be no worse off than we are now," Martha replied. "Right now, we live in fear of Indian attacks every day. At least this way, we have a chance for something better." The debate continued for hours, with opinions divided almost evenly between those who wanted to try negotiating with Red Eagle and those who believed it was too dangerous. Finally, Frank Morrison called for a formal vote. All in favor of meeting with Chief Red Eagle again to discuss his proposal? He asked. Hands went up slowly around the room. Martha counted them carefully, 18 in favor. All opposed. 16 hands rose this time. The motion carries, Frank announced. We'll hear what the chief has to say when he returns. That doesn't mean we're committed to anything yet, but we'll listen to his full proposal. As the meeting broke up, several of the settlers approached Martha with questions and concerns. Some thanked her for potentially opening a path to peace, while others made it clear they held her responsible for whatever came next. Martha walked home with her children as the sun was setting, her mind spinning with the day's revelations. Samuel and Emma peppered her with questions about the Indians and what they had wanted, and she tried to explain the situation in terms they could understand. So the Indian boy's daddy came to say thank you? Emma asked. Yes, sweetheart. And he brought some friends with him to make sure we knew how grateful he was. Will we see the boy again? Samuel wanted to know. I don't know, Martha admitted. Maybe if his father and our neighbors can learn to trust each other. That night, as Martha tucked her children into bed, Emma asked one more question that stopped her cold. Mama, if the Indians come to live near us, does that mean there won't be any more fighting? Martha looked down at her daughter's innocent face and wished she could promise that peace was possible. But she had learned too much about the world to make guarantees about the future. I hope so, baby, she said softly. I really hope so. After the children were asleep, Martha sat by the window looking out at the prairie under the starlight. Somewhere out there, Chief Red Eagle was riding back to his people, carrying the news that the white settlers were willing to at least discuss his proposal. Somewhere out there, Running Wolf was probably telling his friends about the strange white woman who had pulled him from the quicksand. Martha opened the pouch of seeds and studied them in the lamplight. According to Red Eagle, these varieties had been cultivated by his people for generations, bred to grow in harmony with each other and to thrive in the harsh conditions of the Texas plains. If she planted them correctly, they could provide food for her family through the coming winter. But they represented something more than just sustenance. They were a symbol of trust, a gesture of faith in the possibility that two very different peoples could find common ground. Whether that faith would be justified remained to be seen. Martha carefully closed the seed pouch and placed it on her bedside table. Tomorrow, she would prepare a garden plot for the three sisters. And in 1 month's time, when the full moon rose over Cedar Creek, she would find out whether her act of compassion toward a trapped child would lead to lasting peace or renewed conflict. Outside, a coyote howled in the distance, and Martha shivered despite the warm night air. The sound seemed to echo her own uncertainty about what the future held for all of them. The days that followed Chief Red Eagle's visit passed with agonizing slowness for Martha and the other settlers of Cedar Creek. Every morning brought the same questions. Would this be the day the Comanche returned? Had they changed their minds about negotiating? Were they gathering more warriors for an attack? Martha tried to maintain her normal routine, but the weight of responsibility she felt was overwhelming. She had become the unofficial liaison between the settlement and the Comanche, a role she had never sought and wasn't sure she was qualified to fill. Some of her neighbors looked to her for reassurance about Red Eagle's intentions, while others blamed her for putting the entire community at risk. The seeds that Running Wolf's father had given her became both a source of hope and anxiety. Martha planted them in a carefully prepared plot behind her cabin, following the traditional three sisters method that Red Eagle had described. The corn would provide a natural trellis for the beans to climb, while the squash would spread along the ground to shade the roots and conserve moisture. If the stories were true, this ancient combination would produce more food from a small area than any European farming method. But as Martha tended the growing plants, she couldn't help wondering if she would live to harvest them. Despite Red Eagle's peaceful words, 30 armed Comanche warriors had made a powerful impression on the settlement. Fear hung over Cedar Creek like a storm cloud, and Martha sometimes caught her neighbors staring at her with expressions that mixed hope and resentment in equal measure. Samuel and Emma had adapted to the tension with the resilience of childhood, but Martha could see that they were affected by the adult's anxiety. Samuel had become more serious and protective, staying close to home and watching the horizon with worried eyes. Emma had started having nightmares about painted men on horses and would only sleep if Martha promised to keep the rifle loaded and ready. 2 weeks after Red Eagle's visit, a traveling merchant named Jacob Wheeler arrived in Cedar Creek with news from the wider world. He was a grizzled man in his 50s who made his living trading goods between the scattered settlements of Texas, and he had an encyclopedic knowledge of Indian activity throughout the region. "Heard you folks had some Comanche visitors," he said as he unloaded supplies at Morrison's store. "That's Red Eagle's bunch, if I'm not mistaken. Surprised they didn't burn you out." Frank Morrison, who had been helping with the unloading, paused to wipe sweat from his forehead. "They came to talk, not fight. Said they wanted to negotiate a peace treaty." Wheeler snorted with disbelief. "Peace treaty? With Comanche? Friend, I've been trading in Texas for 20 years, and I've never met a Comanche you could trust further than you could throw him. They'll promise you the moon and stars, then scalp you the minute you turn your back." "This might be different," Martha interjected, joining the conversation. Chief Red Eagle seemed sincere about wanting to avoid more bloodshed. The merchant's eyes sharpened with interest when he saw her. "You must be the woman who saved the chief's boy. Word of that spread pretty far already. Some folks are calling you either the bravest woman in Texas or the biggest fool, depending on their point of view." Martha felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I just did what anyone would do for a child in danger." "Maybe," Wheeler said, studying her with calculating eyes. "But you should know that your little rescue has stirred up more than just gratitude among the Indians. There are Comanche bands who see Red Eagle's peace talk as weakness. Some of them are talking about taking action to prove that negotiating with whites is a mistake." Frank Morrison's expression grew grim. "What kind of action?" "The kind that involves war paint and scalping knives," Wheeler replied bluntly. "Word is that War Cloud's band is heading this way, looking to show Red Eagle what they think of his peace treaty. War Cloud lost 2 sons to cavalry soldiers last year, and he's got no love for any white folks." Martha felt the blood drain from her face. "How many warriors does War Cloud have?" "Near about 50, last I heard. And they're some of the fiercest fighters on the plains. If they decide to hit this settlement, Red Eagle's protection won't mean much." The news spread quickly through Cedar Creek, and by evening another town meeting had been called. The mood in Morrison's house was grimmer than it had been 2 weeks earlier, with fear and anger replacing the cautious optimism that had followed Red Eagle's visit. "I told you trusting Indians was a mistake," Tom Bradley declared. "Now we've got 2 bands of Comanche to worry about instead of just avoiding them altogether." "That's not fair, Tom," Martha replied. "Red Eagle didn't bring this trouble on us. We would have been just as vulnerable to War Cloud's raiders whether we met with him or not." "Maybe, but at least we wouldn't have given them a reason to single us out," Bradley shot back. "Now they see us as collaborators with their enemies." Frank Morrison called for order. "Arguing about what we should have done won't help us now. The question is what we do next. Do we still meet with Red Eagle when he returns, or do we abandon the idea of a treaty? How can we negotiate with him when there's another band of hostiles heading this way?" someone called out. Even if Red Eagle means well, he can't control every Comanche in Texas. Martha stood up, her legs trembling but her voice steady. That's exactly why we need to go through with the treaty. If we can make a formal alliance with Red Eagle's band, they might help protect us from War Cloud. The room erupted in debate, with voices raised on all sides. Some settlers agreed with Martha's reasoning, while others insisted that making any deal with Indians would only make them bigger targets for other hostile tribes. Jacob Wheeler, who had been invited to share his knowledge of Indian affairs, raised his hand for attention. "I've got a suggestion," he said. "There's a cavalry patrol due to pass through this area next week. Captain Hayes is leading about 40 troopers on a sweep of the Northern Territories. If you could get word to him about the situation here, he might be willing to provide some protection." "What makes you think the Army would care about protecting a small settlement like ours?" Frank asked. "They care about preventing Indian wars," Wheeler replied. "If War Cloud attacks Cedar Creek, it'll be all the excuse the politicians need to launch a full military campaign against the Comanche. Captain Hayes is smart enough to know that preventing one massacre is easier than fighting a war." Martha felt a chill at the merchant's casual use of the word massacre, but she could see that others in the room were intrigued by the possibility of military protection. "How do we get word to this Captain Hayes?" Frank asked. "I could carry a message," Wheeler offered. "I'm heading north anyway, and I know where the patrol is likely to be. But you need to decide quickly what you want to say." The debate continued late into the night, with the settlers struggling to balance their desire for safety with their uncertainty about whom to trust. Some wanted to ask the cavalry for immediate protection, while others feared that bringing soldiers to the area would only escalate the conflict. Martha found herself caught between competing loyalties and instincts. Part of her wanted the security that military protection would provide for her children, but another part worried that the presence of cavalry troops would destroy any chance of peace with Red Eagle's band. "What if we sent 2 messages?" she suggested during a lull in the arguments. One to Captain Hayes, asking him to be ready to help if we're attacked, and another to Chief Red Eagle, warning him about War Cloud and asking if he can provide any protection. "That's assuming we could trust Red Eagle," Tom Bradley said skeptically. "It's also assuming that Captain Hayes would care enough about our problems to change his patrol route," another settler added. Frank Morrison rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "It's not a perfect plan, but it might be our best option. If Red Eagle is sincere about wanting peace, he'll appreciate the warning about War Cloud. And if War Cloud does attack, we'll need all the help we can get." After more discussion, the settlers agreed to Martha's proposal. Jacob Wheeler would carry a message to the cavalry patrol, explaining the situation and requesting assistance if needed. Meanwhile, Martha would find a way to get word to Red Eagle about the approaching threat. The question of how to contact the Comanche chief proved more complicated than anyone had anticipated. Wheeler agreed to ask other traders if they had seen Red Eagle's band, but there was no guarantee that such a message would reach him in time. "What about the boy?" Martha asked suddenly. Running Wolf seemed intelligent and mature for his age. "If I could find him and explain the situation, he might be able to warn his father." "And how exactly do you propose to find one Indian boy in thousands of square miles of prairie?" Frank asked. Martha had been thinking about that problem since the meeting began. "The quicksand where I found him, that has to be near their regular camping area. They wouldn't let children wander too far from the village, and he said he was supposed to be back by sunset. If I went back to that spot and waited, maybe someone from their band would come by." The room fell silent as the settlers absorbed the implications of what Martha was suggesting. "You want to go out onto the prairie alone and try to find a Comanche camp?" Frank said incredulously. "Martha, that's suicide." Not necessarily, Martha replied, though her heart was racing at her own boldness. Red Eagle said I was under his protection. If his people found me looking for them, they would probably take me to him safely. And if Warcloud's warriors found you first? Someone asked. Martha swallowed hard. Then, at least you would know they were in the area and could prepare accordingly. The debate over Martha's plan continued for another hour, but eventually the settlers agreed that it was their best hope of warning Red Eagle in time. Frank Morrison insisted on accompanying her, but Martha persuaded him that a single woman would seem less threatening than an armed man. Besides, she pointed out, if something happens to me, the settlement will still need your leadership. You can't risk both of us. 3 days later, Martha kissed her children goodbye and set out for the river where she had first encountered Running Wolf. Samuel cried when she left, somehow sensing that this journey was more dangerous than their mother was admitting. Emma simply clung to her with desperate intensity, as if trying to memorize the feeling of her mother's embrace. I'll be back soon, Martha promised, hoping it was true. Mrs. Morrison will take good care of you while I'm gone. The ride to the river took most of the morning, and Martha had plenty of time to question the wisdom of her plan. What if she couldn't find any sign of the Comanche? What if Warcloud's warriors were already in the area? What if Red Eagle had changed his mind about protecting her? But as Martha reached the grove of cottonwood trees where she had rescued Running Wolf, her doubts were temporarily forgotten. The quicksand that had nearly claimed the boy's life was still there, looking deceptively solid in the morning sunlight. Martha dismounted and tied her horse to a tree, then settled down to wait. The hours passed slowly, marked only by the movement of shadows and the distant calls of birds. Martha had brought food and water, prepared for a long vigil, but as the afternoon wore on, she began to wonder if she had made a terrible mistake. Just as she was considering giving up and returning home, Martha heard the soft sound of approaching hoofbeats. Her heart leaped with a mixture of hope and terror as 3 Comanche riders emerged from the tall grass. She recognized none of them, but their painted faces and weapons marked them clearly as warriors. The Indians spotted Martha immediately and rode toward her with obvious suspicion. She stood slowly, keeping her hands visible and trying to project calm confidence despite her racing pulse. The lead warrior said something in Comanche that Martha couldn't understand, but his tone was clearly questioning. She took a deep breath and replied in English, I am Martha Henderson, the white woman who saved Running Wolf from the quicksand. I need to speak with Chief Red Eagle about a matter of great importance. The warriors exchanged glances, and Martha caught the name Running Wolf in their rapid conversation. After what seemed like an eternity, the lead warrior nodded curtly and gestured for her to mount her horse. The ride to the Comanche camp took nearly 2 hours, winding through terrain that Martha would never have been able to navigate alone. The warriors set a swift pace, clearly eager to reach their destination before dark. As they crested a low hill, Martha got her first glimpse of a Comanche village. It was larger than she had expected, with perhaps 60 teepees arranged in a rough circle around a central area where cooking fires burned and children played. Dogs barked as the riders approached, and people emerged from their homes to stare at the unexpected white visitor. Chief Red Eagle appeared almost immediately, his face a mask of concern and curiosity. He spoke quickly to the warriors who had brought Martha, then approached her with measured steps. Martha Henderson, he said formally, you honor us with your visit, but I'm troubled that you would risk coming here alone. What brings you to our camp? Martha dismounted and faced the chief, acutely aware of the dozens of eyes watching their every move. "I came to warn you," she said. "There's another Comanche band heading toward our area. Their chief is called War Cloud, and he opposes your efforts to make peace with the whites." Red Eagle's expression darkened. "Va Cloud. Yes, I know of him. He has sent messengers to other bands, calling me a fool and a traitor for dealing with your people. Our merchant friend says War Cloud has 50 warriors and plans to attack our settlement to prove that negotiating with whites is useless." The chief nodded grimly. "This is worse than I feared. War Cloud is a skilled war leader, and his hatred runs deep. If he attacks your people, it will destroy any chance of peace between our peoples. Can you stop him?" Martha asked. Red Eagle was quiet for a long moment, staring toward the western horizon where the sun was beginning to set. "Perhaps," he said finally, "but it would mean fighting my own people, spilling Comanche blood to protect whites. Many of my own warriors would question such a decision. What if we fought together?" Martha suggested. "Your band and our settlement standing as allies against War Cloud. Wouldn't that prove that cooperation between our peoples is possible?" The chief's eyes sharpened with interest. "You would fight beside Comanche warriors against other Comanche? If it meant protecting our families and preserving the chance for peace, yes," Martha replied without hesitation. Red Eagle studied her face for several seconds, then nodded slowly. "You have the heart of a warrior, Martha Henderson. Very well, we will try this alliance of yours. But first I must speak with my council and convince them that this path offers hope for our people's future." The next few hours passed in a blur of activity as Red Eagle gathered his war chiefs and elders to discuss Martha's proposal. She was given food and a place to rest, but sleep was impossible as she listened to the heated debates echoing from the council teepee. Running Wolf found her as she sat by one of the cooking fires, staring into the flames and wondering if she had made the right choice. The boy looked older than he had 3 weeks earlier, with new confidence in his bearing and wisdom in his dark eyes. "My father says you came here alone to warn us of danger," he said, settling beside her with the easy grace of his people. "That was very brave." "It was very necessary," Martha corrected. "If War Cloud destroys our settlement, there will be no chance for peace between our peoples. Some of the warriors say that peace with whites is impossible anyway," Running Wolf replied. "They say your people will never stop taking our land and killing our buffalo." Martha looked at the intelligent young face beside her. "What do you think?" Running Wolf was quiet for several minutes, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I think," he said finally, "that the old ways are ending whether we want them to or not. Too many whites are coming, and they have too many guns. We can fight them and die, or we can find a new way to live. Your father is trying to find that new way." "Yes, and you are helping him, even though it puts you in danger. That is why I believe it might be possible." The council meeting continued until well past midnight, with voices rising and falling in passionate debate. Martha dozed fitfully by the dying fire, waking periodically to the sound of arguments that seemed to grow more heated as the night wore on. Finally, as dawn was breaking over the prairie, Red Eagle emerged from the council teepee. His face was grave, but determined as he approached Martha. "It is decided," he announced. "We will ride with you to defend your settlement against War Cloud. But this alliance comes with conditions." "What conditions?" Martha asked. "If we fight together and survive, your people must commit to the treaty we discussed. No more raids by either side, shared use of hunting grounds and water sources, and regular meetings to resolve disputes peacefully. Martha nodded. I'll do everything I can to convince them to accept those terms. There is one more condition, Red Eagle continued. You must ride with us as our representative. Your presence will remind my warriors why they are fighting, and it will show Warcloud that some whites can be trusted. The request terrified Martha, but she could see the logic in it. Her participation would be a powerful symbol of the alliance between the two peoples. I accept, she said, hoping her voice sounded steadier than she felt. Red Eagle smiled for the first time since her arrival. Then, we ride at sunrise. Warcloud scouts were seen yesterday evening, which means his main force will reach your settlement sometime tomorrow. The next few hours passed in frantic preparation. Red Eagle's warriors painted themselves for battle and checked their weapons, while Martha wrote a hasty letter explaining the situation to Frank Morrison and the other settlers. A young warrior was dispatched to carry the message to Cedar Creek, racing ahead of the main force to warn the settlement that help was coming. As the sun rose over the prairie, Martha found herself mounted on a Comanche pony and surrounded by 30 painted warriors. She had traded her dress for buckskin clothing borrowed from one of the women, and her hair was braided in the Indian fashion to help her blend in from a distance. Red Eagle took his place at the head of the column, with Martha riding beside him as a symbol of their alliance. Running Wolf had begged to be allowed to come along, but his father had firmly refused. This is work for warriors, the chief had explained. Your time will come, but not today. The ride back to Cedar Creek took most of the day, with frequent stops to rest the horses and scout for signs of Warcloud's band. As they drew closer to the settlement, the tension among the warriors became palpable. Many of them had never worked with whites before, and Martha could see doubt and suspicion in their faces. Late in the afternoon, one of Red Eagle's scouts came racing back with urgent news. Warcloud's warriors had been spotted less than 5 miles from Cedar Creek, moving slowly and apparently preparing for a dawn attack on the settlement. We have little time, Red Eagle announced. If we're to save your people, we must move quickly and strike before Warcloud expects resistance. The final approach to Cedar Creek was made under cover of darkness, with the Comanche warriors moving with silent precision through the tall grass. Martha's heart pounded as she saw the familiar buildings of her hometown, knowing that her children were sleeping somewhere in the darkness ahead. Red Eagle deployed his warriors in a defensive line between Warcloud's approaching force and the settlement, with Martha positioned at the center where she could be protected. As they waited for dawn and the inevitable battle, she found herself thinking about the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. 3 weeks ago, she had been just another frontier widow struggling to survive. Now, she was about to fight alongside Comanche warriors to defend her community and preserve a fragile chance for peace. The irony was not lost on her that saving one Indian child from Quicksand had led to this alliance that might save many lives on both sides. As the eastern sky began to lighten, Warcloud's warriors appeared on the ridge overlooking Cedar Creek. There were indeed about 50 of them, painted and armed for battle, confident in their superiority over a small settlement of farmers and ranchers. What they didn't expect was to find 30 Comanche warriors waiting for them, led by a chief whose reputation as a fighter was second to none. Warcloud himself rode forward when he saw Red Eagle's force, his face twisted with rage and contempt. The two chiefs met in the space between their forces, their voices carrying clearly in the still morning air as they spoke in rapid Comanche. Martha couldn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakably hostile. The confrontation lasted several minutes, with Warcloud gesturing angrily toward the settlement and Red Eagle responding with calm but firm words. Finally, Warcloud wheeled his horse and rode back toward his warriors, shouting what sounded like orders for attack. "He says I am a traitor to our people," Red Eagle explained to Martha. "He will not listen to talk of peace. Now we must let our actions speak for us." The battle that followed was brief, but fierce. Warcloud's warriors charged down the hill toward the settlement, only to find themselves caught between Red Eagle's defensive line and the rifles of the settlers who had emerged from their homes. Martha watched in fascination and horror as the two forces of Comanche warriors clashed with each other, while the white settlers fired from protected positions around their buildings. The sound of gunshots and war cries filled the morning air, punctuated by the screams of wounded horses and men. The turning point came when Warcloud himself fell, struck down by a rifle shot from one of the settlement's defenders. His death took the heart out of his warriors' attack, and they began to fall back toward the hills. Red Eagle rallied his men for a final charge that broke Warcloud's remaining resistance. Those warriors who survived the battle scattered across the prairie, carrying word of their defeat back to other bands. As the smoke cleared and the last echoes of gunfire faded, Martha found herself looking at a battlefield littered with the bodies of Comanche warriors who had died fighting each other over the question of how to deal with white settlement. "It is finished," Red Eagle said grimly, surveying the carnage. "Warcloud will trouble no one again, and his followers are scattered. But the cost has been high." Martha nodded, feeling the weight of all the lives that had been lost in the morning's fighting. But she also felt hope for the first time in weeks. The alliance between Red Eagle's band and Cedar Creek had held under the ultimate test, and both communities had survived. Frank Morrison approached them cautiously, his rifle still in his hands, but pointed downward in a gesture of peace. "Chief Red Eagle," he said formally, "we owe you a debt that can never be repaid. Your warriors fought bravely to protect our families, and your people fought bravely beside us," the chief replied. "This is what alliance means, standing together against common enemies." In the days that followed, the survivors of both communities worked together to bury the dead and care for the wounded. The experience of fighting side by side had broken down many of the barriers of fear and mistrust that had separated them. The treaty that Red Eagle had proposed was formally signed 2 weeks later, establishing the first successful peace agreement between a Comanche band and a white settlement in Texas. It would serve as a model for other such agreements, though the path to lasting peace would prove long and difficult. Martha's role in creating this alliance made her something of a celebrity throughout Texas, but she always insisted that she had simply done what any mother would do for a child in danger. The silver medallion that Running Wolf had given her became a treasured symbol of the friendship between the two peoples. Years later, when Running Wolf had grown to become a respected leader in his own right, he would often visit Cedar Creek with his children and tell them the story of the white woman who had saved him from the quicksand. And Martha, now gray-haired but still strong, would tell her grandchildren about the day when a simple act of kindness had changed the course of history on the Texas frontier. The seeds that Red Eagle had given her grew into bountiful harvests that sustained not only Martha's family, but also served as gifts to cement the friendship between the two communities. The three sisters, corn, beans, and squash, became symbols of how different peoples could grow stronger when they supported each other. The alliance between Cedar Creek and Red Eagle's band lasted for more than 20 years, until the great changes brought by the Civil War and Reconstruction finally overtook them. But during those 2 decades, it provided a beacon of hope that showed how understanding and cooperation could triumph over fear and hatred. Martha Henderson's name was eventually forgotten by history, as the names of most ordinary people are. But her legacy lived on in the children and grandchildren of both communities who grew up learning that courage and compassion could bridge even the greatest divides between different peoples. And in the end, that lesson proved to be worth more than all the battles ever fought on the Texas frontier.